But when you are on the floor, having shoved a towel in your mouth to try and cover the sound of you screaming so your baby daughter doesn't hear because you don't want her to be afraid in sort of 2 rooms away while your wife looks after her, I think it's impossible for anyone, no matter what their relationship to masculinity, to feel diminished by that.
What is your expertise? What gives you license to write a book about anxiety?
So the awful truth is that I was sitting down having written sort of a couple of novels and thinking, what can I write about? And I'd written nonfiction before. And I was like, what am I an expert for? Because like you say, like when you're pitching something, whether it's like an article or a book, one of the 4 pitch lines, it's like, this is a story about this, or I wanted to look into this. The reason why I'm the person to do this, and you shouldn't get a better known celebrity to do it instead, is because this is my area of expertise. And I was like, what am I an expert on? And it was like, well, I'm mentally ill. Like, I guess, like, I'm really anxious. Like, I was like, at the time, like, I had a 2-year-old daughter. She's just older now. I still have a daughter. She's just older. But, and I was really struggling with like severe anxiety and panic that was like, I was having panic attacks every week. Sometimes I was having multiple ones a day that would like put me on the floor, and I'd have several a day over like a 3-day period. And I was like, this is just unlivable. And also, in my work, doing like a creative writing podcast, I'd started to have like neuroscientists on. I'd started having psychologists on. I studied like 4 years of psychology back in school, but I'm not like qualified. My background is in writing, but I'd spoken to these guys and had some really interesting beginning talks about the brain and, the differences when they put like writers in an fMRI scanner and stuff like that. And so I was like, and then we signed my daughter up to a developmental study where they started studying her brain and the development of kids at different ages. And I got to take her in and see, they put this thing called an FNIRS on her, it's like a portable scanner in a kind of skull cap. It looks like a Medusa fright wig. They stick it on her head. She looked like she looked like a cross between Medusa, and this is like a very deep cut nerd reference, but like when Patrick Stewart plays like Locutus out of the Borg, she looked like one of the Borg. She had like one red eyepiece on that tracks her vision, and I was seeing on a computer different parts of her brain lighting up because of something called the BOLD response, the blood oxygen level dependent response, showing different parts of her brain as different levels of demand wanted more or less oxygen. And I was like, I'm watching my daughter think. We are at a level now where psychology and neuroscience, we can like look inside people's heads. And I'm like, there's got to, like, I only get access to this because we signed up to this study, but I'm like, I now know there's researchers out there who are willing to speak to me for some reason. And I guess the thing was, I just wanted to get well. And I was like, well, if I say I'm writing a book, these people are going to open their doors to me.
They have to talk to me.
Exactly. I'm going to be able to grandfather myself in to speak to all these people. And then I'm going to go like, and at the same time, I'd like, like if you've got hay fever, everyone in your family will like send you emails going, hey, I just read this article with this like their homespun remedy on how to beat hay fever. And you get it
honey. Yeah, you need to spread the Manuka honey over your nasal cavity or something.
Exactly. And you'll never be short of suggestions. Well, obviously people knowing that I was really scared, I was never short of people making suggestions, sending me articles, and you see all these articles saying this new treatment has been found. So I was like, I keep reading that we're like 5 years away from this treatment that's going to blow it open, whether it was a new drug, a new a new strategy that people were doing, like they use social prescribing, people going for walks, forest bathing, ice baths, things like that. And I was like, what if I just go and speak to the people? There are people who are spending their lives studying this in all different disciplines. What if I go and speak to them and then I try and do everything. Because the other thing was, I'd also read all the studies on the effect of mental illness, a parent's mental illness on children, and how that stuff starts early and it gets passed down, and how across a whole range of profiles it makes kids' outcomes worse. And like stuff you'd expect, like their chance of mental illness being worse, but also crazy stuff like their chance of having asthma. And I was like, I want my daughter to have the best chance in life she can. And like some of us can be like really down on ourselves and go like, I can't do this, I'm not worth it. But like the bottom line was, do I think it's worth having a go at this for my daughter's sake? You know, if I don't care about myself, do I care about her? And the answer was like, yeah.
That's one hell of a motivator. Yeah,
I know. Yeah. And so that's how the short answer to your question was, when I started out doing this, in terms of my qualification, I was quite smug. I was like, I've been really anxious for ages. I have the worst panic attacks out of anyone I've ever encountered. I've read a lot of articles. My nan has sent me a lot of clippings. I was like, I'll go and speak to a couple of scientists, right? And they'll kind of sprinkle a little bit of legitimacy pixie dust on the top of it. They'll just quote stuff that I kind of already know. I'll go, yeah. I thought I'd sit in there, I'd get into their labs, I'd chat with them, and they'd tell me stuff, and I'd go, because of course it's this, isn't it? I'd go, it's the amygdala, right? And they'd go, oh, you know about that? Oh, you're a colleague. And we'd kind of like nod, and they'd see that I was an expert. And then I'd go and write my book. And it's only when I went out and started speaking to people, and they're going, no, Tim, it doesn't work like that at all. And I was like, oh, I'm in deep trouble. I'm in really deep trouble. And then I just went down this rabbit hole, read over 1,000 peer-reviewed studies, end to end, spoke to dozens of people, including like every expert that I could find in all sorts of disciplines. And by the end of it, like at least what I can say is I know how little I know, if that makes sense. Like I know how dumb I am, and I know what the edges of my knowledge in any given discipline are.
Well, the difference is that you've got that in the trenches experience, you know, like even if it wasn't medical understanding originally, you were able to appreciate it from an experiential standpoint, right? So what, for the people that haven't had one, how do you describe what a panic attack feels like? So
I went to you can get a technical answer, right? Which is you go to the DSM-5 and there's a list of symptoms, right? And you have to have like X number from a list of symptoms, and then it's officially diagnosed. A psychiatrist could say, yeah, you've had a panic attack, right? And I think it's just like a hair under 8,000 possible like acceptable combinations of symptoms you can have for a panic attack. So they're incredibly diverse. But reading the explanation of what a panic attack is, it's kind of like licking a photograph of an ice cream, right? Like describing a panic attack. I can tell you that it feels like it can feel like you're going mad. Like a lot of people, especially men, don't know they've got panic disorder until they present at A&E saying they're having a heart attack. They think that they're having a heart attack, that they're having cardiac arrest. They go to A&E and the doctor's like, no, you're having a panic attack, because so many of the symptoms are the same: breathlessness, what they call like air hunger, but also a feeling of like derealization, which is really difficult to describe until you've been through it, but you can feel like nothing's quite real, like this sudden feeling that you're in a dream, which is also why a lot of people who are having a panic attack think they're going mad or insane. Your airways closing up, dizziness, racing heart, sweating, trembling. You might start getting pins and needles in your extremities. Your extremities might start, they call that pins and needles, and your extremities your fingers might start going into claws, which they call tetany, which is to do with like calcium deficiency as you breathe so hard. You might obviously like feelings of dread and fear, often terror. I mean, my panic attacks, But all of this is like, if I described, like, they call it, they'll call it in the literature, they'll say a panic attack is like this feeling of sudden dread and fear accompanied by extreme physiological symptoms, which is a bit like calling like being kicked in the balls, like a sudden extreme pressure to the testicles, right? Like, it's a very, very different thing to go through it. And you're like, hey, hang on. And even after I'd had one, I'd look back and go, yeah, but that's not so bad. And then you're going through it and you feel like you're dying. And it's ridiculous. In a sense, it is ridiculous because you're not. But there's various ways and various elements that I would later learn speaking to like pulmonary biologists and psychiatrists about the physiology that makes it actually very difficult to think straight while you're having one. It's not just a failure of character. So that's what it is. But I would say, like, they can present very differently. Some people have talked to me we talk about the fight, flight or freeze response, right? Those kind of three things. And panic attacks, I would say you can kind of split them into those three categories. Some people, you wouldn't necessarily know that they're having a panic attack. They just go completely frozen up. I've had a friend I talked to who said he had a panic attack on stage while doing a stand-up gig, right? And he's at the mic and he starts having a panic attack. Now, all that people saw was him going completely silent, completely still and staring out like wall-eyed over this. It looked like stage fright, right? From his perspective, he's having a panic attack. He can't breathe. There are other people like me that, like, honestly, it looks like a toddler having a tantrum. Like, I'm like on the floor. I might be screaming. I might be saying I can't breathe. I'm like sweating. I might be like convulsing. You might think I'm having a heart attack. It was super embarrassing. It was like the least dignified thing you could. The only way I could have been worse if I was like doing kind of like honking farts while I was doing it.
I was literally about to say the only thing you could have done was shit yourself at the same time, and that would have somehow made it worse. Like you're emotionally shitting yourself. Yeah, that's how it's that like complete like incontinence of like emotion and terror, which would, when we see them in kind of, the panic attack is preserved amazingly well over like millions of years of evolution. You can get very similar reactions from, like voles and stoats. Why does it exist? How is it adaptive to have a panic attack? Okay,
so that's a fantastic question, and there's loads of like people have jumped on this, like going, why? And there was a psychiatrist called Donald Klein who in 2003 wrote a paper where his theory was he sees it as a kind of he called it like a suffocation false alarm. So he's going back to, like, we know that panic attacks can be reliably triggered by something called the CO2 challenge, right? Where you give someone a mask and they breathe in a mix of air that's got 25% CO2 in it, carbon dioxide, right? That reliably gives people like smashes of a panic attack. Like, it's the grimmest thing. It's quite, and I've spoken to a psychiatrist who, did it himself before he used it in his experiments. But we know that people who are vulnerable to panic attacks are much more likely to have bigger and worse panic attacks when they do that challenge. And it's one breath, by the way. Like, you put this mask on, you take one deep breath.
No way.
It's I people who've done it have like said you can't. I should say, like, there's a famous patient called patient SM who had her amygdala, both her amygdalas removed, her amygdalae. They're these parts of the brain that have often been thought by kind of like, when they talk about them in magazine articles, they call it the brain's fear center. Now, it's not, but it is definitely implicated in our threat circuit. She'd had this rare genetic condition that meant she lost both of her amygdala, were eaten away by calcium deposits. She couldn't feel fear. She had like a gun held to her head and someone threatened to kill her. She didn't even realize that they were threatening her. They've done all these tests on her. They had her held snakes. They took her to like a fun house, and there was a guy dressed up as like Pinhead out of the Hellraiser movies. And apparently she made him jump because she went up and grabbed one of the nails coming out of his mask just to find out what was going on. She's been beaten up. She's been assaulted. At no point has she felt fear.
Not all of these were in an experiment. I'm going to guess.
No. Right. They're super. They're actually, the experimenters, all of them that talked about her, were really sort of protective and tender about her. She wasn't like some weird, like caged
well, the problem that you have with someone that doesn't have any fear is that they're pretty bad at looking after themselves. If you're not able to do threat response or threat detection very well, you're unbelievably vulnerable.
Yeah, and that's been there's case studies from her life where, a really sketchy guy just like rolled up in his car and said, "Do you want to get in and come with me?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, hi." Yeah. And he took her to a abandoned barn and assaulted her. Like, she's had that throughout her life, trusting people.
But then she does the mask thing.
Yeah. And then, but this is the thing, is like, she's just not able to. She does this. She did this CO2 challenge, this 25%, and she had the worst panic attack they'd ever seen with that. So even somebody who cannot feel fear in their life had a panic attack, a terrifying one, when she had it. Now, the difference with her is afterwards, they said, "Do you want to do it again?" She was like, "Yeah, all right." She wasn't able to learn from the experience, but during it, she was screaming, "I can't breathe." She was grabbing for the... So the theory is that these chemoreceptors in the brain are there, developed from when we were kind of like burrowing animals. You go to sleep in a burrow, it collapses, CO2 levels will start going up because you're going to suffocate. You want something that will just flood the body during sleep with adrenaline, cortisol, get the heart hammering, and go just move, scrabble, thrash around, try and get out. That's Donald Klein's theory, that it's preserved because there was a time when it was adaptive to wake up suddenly, because and it kind of still is, right? Like, we know that children who have seizures during the night can, if the seizure reaches the amygdala, they are capable of just stopping breathing. In fact, they've had this has been one of the problems with COVID. There have been COVID patients who stop breathing, have incredibly low oxygen levels, and just aren't aware. They call them happy hypoxics, right? Like, the infection, this kind of neuro might reach the amygdala, and these chemoreceptors are somehow affected in the same way that people report sort of problems with taste and smell, and they don't know that they're not breathing. And that little alarm that says, shit, like, you're suffocating, you've got to breathe now, and sort of jolts you awake, doesn't go off, and people can just sit there and pass out. So that's one of the theories. Another theory is that, like, a panic attack is like the last resort of the fight, flight, or freeze, the like most primal response to being like attacked by a predator. Like, if everything else has failed, if you've frozen and they still find you, if you try to run away and you still get caught, if you tried to fight, the last thing is just to flood the body with adrenaline. And so you thrash, you scream, you fight in the hope that, like, basically it drops you, that, or it like so it's like this last ditch effort, which is one guy I spoke to, John Wemme, who's like a psychiatrist, and he does like pulmonary biology and things like that, and he performs this CO2 test. His position was like, he said, when the amygdala is removed, what the amygdala might do is help us decide which of the fight, flight, or freeze options you've got to choose, right? When you get this flood of adrenaline, it might help us decide it. And when that's removed, we might just always default to the worst thing, which is like panic attacks, right? So the amygdala is almost like a kind of spigot that chooses how much water you want, and if you hack the spigot off, it's just going to jet water. So that's one theory of panic attacks. Why some of the elements of them might be adaptive. That it's a chemoreceptor in the brain. There's various areas that might have chemoreceptors. The amygdala might have them, but also periaqueductal grey, kind of like around the back. You might have these oversensitive chemoreceptors. And actually, when they've done ambulatory monitoring of people who have panic attacks, where they monitor their breathing as they walk around throughout their daily life, they find that a lot of people who have panic attacks have a tendency to overbreathe, right? So they're breathing a lot. They're washing out carbon dioxide, they're taking in a lot of oxygen, and so as they do that, right, they're slowly training this kind of like this canary in the mine shaft, right, these chemoreceptors to be more and more acutely aware of the tiniest bit of CO2. And so all you need then is a period where, people frequently with panic disorder will wake up in the night having a panic attack. So there's been no trigger. It's not like they're in a shopping centre and they feel claustrophobic. They're in bed and they wake up thinking they're having a heart attack, right? And so there may be some it happens. Panic disorder correlates with like sleep apnea and like respiratory problems, people who have them. So there may be some dysregulation of breathing. And then, of course, what happens if you're having a panic attack, which we often think is part of it, but it's sort of almost a second stage, is then you overbreathe, you hyperventilate, which, I mean, I don't know, like if you hyperventilate, it has all these crazy effects on, and this is what I didn't realize, I didn't get, was like, and it also explains the very traditional method of stopping someone having a panic attack, right? Where you see them on the old movies where they breathe into a paper bag, right?
Yeah.
And that's not really dealing with panic attack so much as the effects of hyperventilation, which are like an overcorrection afterwards, right? Someone breathes and breathes and breathes. It washes out all the CO2. And then with all that lack of CO2 in the bloodstream, you get something called cerebral hypoxia, where the brain is flooded with oxygen, and as a response, you get vasoconstriction in the brain. So the capillaries, after about a minute of hyperventilating, the capillaries are about 50% of their previous capacity, right? And this is all really complicated. It took me ages to get my head around this, because you're like, well, your bloodstream is full of more oxygen. Surely more's going to your brain. Well, the body is a homeostatic system, and it's constantly trying to make sure different areas are getting what's needed. And if your body thinks it's in fight, flight, or freeze, and your brain thinks it's getting too much oxygen, it'll go, right, we don't need this, right? We're going to restrict the blood vessels. So the rest of the body, presumably we're being chased or in a fight, right? So I'm going to save the rest of that oxygen for the mitochondria in the cells in sort of my legs, so you can run away, right? So we're all right here. And that's a mistake that the brain makes. At the same time, you get this thing called a leftward shift on the hemoglobin dissociation curve, which basically means that hemoglobin, the protein transports of oxygen around the bloodstream, cling on to that oxygen more tightly when you get a carbon dioxide washout. So they don't deliver those oxygen molecules as readily. So not only does your brain get 50% of the blood flow, but all of the oxygen that is flowing through the bloodstream is not letting go of. So your brain, like within a minute, your brain has been massively starved of oxygen. So you start feeling dizzy, you can't think straight, you start getting that derealization, you start thinking you're going mad, you can't take logical steps because your brain is shutting down. And this is why people will regularly, like I say, they will present thinking they're having a heart attack. They'll present thinking that that they've lost their mind. And it's all to do with respiratory function, which is which is mad for me, right? That it's something so simple as like that dysregulation and then over breathing can lead to people thinking, I'm going insane and I'm dying. And it's just a breathing rhythm thing.
Looking at the techniques that you went through in an effort to try and discover what can help anxiety disorders, what did you find out about exercise?
So exercise is a really interesting one. I thought exercise was the first thing I tried, right? Because I was like, well, this is a slam dunk. I mean, I was really, really unfit, like incredibly unfit. My job is 3 meters from my bed. My favorite activities are like video games and sleeping. Like I was not, it's no exaggeration to say I was a dad with a 2-year-old, right? So like my sleep patterns were all out of whack. I was comfort eating because of the anxiety and because of, I'd often get my daughter to bed at a crazy time, and then I'd just like get a takeaway because the idea of then cooking for myself seemed like the least appealing thing. And I thought I deserved a treat. So, but I thought exercise, I was like, everyone's always telling me to do exercise. It'll be a shoo-in. And I went and started looking at the literature. I went to see a trainer called Dave Thomas, who owns a gym in London, who's got like 20,000 hours of like one-to-one sessions under his belt, to talk to him about like sports science and stuff like that. And I started digging into the literature. And what I was surprised to find is the relationship between exercise and reducing anxiety is by no means clear. There's a really interesting paper by a psychologist from Liverpool University called Peter Salmon, who looked at a load of studies on anxiety and exercise. And what he found is that most of the studies that you will read, like in the paper, in magazines, that say, 15 minutes of HIIT a day will reduce anxiety and whatever. The people they get to do though, the sample that they use for those, are generally, and they should be obvious for us, but like people who sign up to those studies are not generally people who hate exercise. They need volunteers, right? And the people who tend to sign up to exercise studies tend to be people who quite like exercise. So for a start, there's a skewed sample in that the people who are doing them are people who generally don't hate exercise. Secondly, the samples that are used, and this is another weird one that surprised me, are often not people who are clinically anxious. They will get people who are just, everyday people, and they will study them. And then they'll give them a survey at the beginning and a survey at the end. And they'll go, do you feel less anxious now than you did before? And often people do, but they weren't clinically anxious to begin with. They just feel more relaxed. Does that mean it works with someone with PTSD or panic disorder? That study doesn't have anything to say on that necessarily. Thirdly, a lot of studies don't really distinguish between what type of exercise. Like there are a lot, exercise is big. That's like just saying, books. Is reading a book good for you? Well, what kind of book? What kind of exercise? Is walking the same as, sprints or, fartlek or HIIT? Are we talking like marathon running? Are we talking about like swimming? What duration are we talking relative intensity to someone's fitness level or absolute intensity? How many days a week for over what period? So all of these questions are ones that are not often well addressed in the current literature. And of course, one of the things that I got from talking to Dave is like, if you start an exercise regime, the first thing it's going to start doing is at least transiently raise your cortisol levels, your adrenaline levels, your testosterone levels as well, which is like more ambiguous when it comes to how that affects anxiety. But your stress hormones are going to go up initially, right? So and it's going to be unpleasant, right? When I started running, doing this book, I fucking hated it. It was grim. I did not start running down the street whistling to myself going, I feel so alive. Oh my God, I hated life so much. I could taste blood in my mouth. I was limping. I was aching. The next day I couldn't get up and down the stairs. I was so angry. And I was like, why am I doing this? I hate doing this. But, and there is a but coming here, right? Despite all that, so those are all the caveats, right? Despite all that, if you then look at the body of literature, there are some great results. One thing I'd say, let's imagine that you did a bunch of exercise, right? And it did nothing for your anxiety, but you started an exercise regime. Well, we already know, you're going to live longer. You're going to have have more energy during the day. You're going to be your risk profile across a range of diseases is going to drop dramatically. So the worst case scenario is that you live longer.
You're a healthier, better, leaner, sexier version of the person you were yesterday. You just still have anxiety.
Exactly. So it's not like, we're asking someone to put their hand in a meat grinder. It's something that's already good for you. I think is sort of unambiguous across the range of literature. But can it help anxiety? Well, there are some suggestions that there are ways it can do. When we look at athletes and some studies of people who exercise regularly and do intense exercise, and they've done some of this with bodybuilders as well, actually in response to a threat, and in the lab, this tends to be something like they call it like a shock protocol. So they literally wire someone up and give them unpredictable electric shocks. That's how they find out someone's stress levels, and they'll check their cortisol with a swab. When you look at these people, actually, their fight, flight, or freeze response, their hormone cascade, is generally more pronounced than people who don't exercise. However, it tends to normalize more quickly as well. So they have almost like more of an adrenaline boost in response to a stimulus, but then they return to baseline faster. And this is something actually we see a lot across a lot of anxiety, that it's not so much someone has it's not like someone has a bigger startle reflex, although that can be part of it, but that they're worse at responding to safety cues and returning to baseline.
Got less equanimity on the other side of it. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, like the and it was true of me that like a can of beans could fall out the cupboard, and that would be me gone for the rest. That'd be my nerves shattered for the morning. I'm just like, I've got to take to my bed now with a case of the vapors and fan myself, saying what shall become of us, because like that was it. Like I was just jittery.
Yeah.
So it's going to normalize that. The other thing is, and I'm sure you'll be thinking about this as well, but like your blood sugar levels, like when in response to a shock, your body is going to release glucose. There's various hormones that release glucose into the bloodstream, anticipating a threat, so it's going to be available to the muscles so you can start running and whatever. So it releases these sugar stores. If you don't immediately use that up, then your body is going to release insulin to reabsorb it, so you get these big crashes. So that's why often people with anxiety have this horrible up and down thing, where you get the shock and then you drop into like the equivalent of a sugar crash afterwards, where you feel sluggish, you can't think, and then of course it's tempting to like have a sugary sports drink or something, which will sort of briefly bring you back up and normalize, but then you start this kind of like your day is this series of peaks and troughs. Exercise can help down regulate some of the kind of corticoid, like some of your receptors that deal with things like cortisol, to make them sort of slightly less responsive, and they can put you in a situation where those kind of like sugar spikes are less pronounced. They help with things like insulin resistance as well, and that's, of course, you are shading into diet now, but exercise is part of that as well.
Well, yeah. What about that? Because I've always heard that there's more serotonin released in your gut than there is in your brain, and that there's a gut-brain connection when it comes to anxiety, and that inflammation is something that you need to watch out for, because you can eat some gluten and you'll have an anxiety attack. What's the lessons to be learned there?
Yeah, so like that's really important, and it's what that serotonin receptors in that you've got that idea of like having loads of serotonin receptors in your gut. Yeah, like serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine, most of it is doing stuff around in different things all across your body, and it's also the reason why you can't just take a serotonin pill, right? Because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier to get into your brain. Won't be available in your brain. You've got a blood-brain barrier that stops like nasties getting into your brain. Obviously, your brain's sort of like very, very. That's one of the reasons why you get kind of like cerebral vasoconstriction so quickly. Why it has these crazy responses is because it's really, really conservative.
Finely tuned.
How Yeah, because it doesn't, because getting a virus into your brain is much, much worse than getting one into your stomach. Like if it's in your stomach, you can just diarrhea it out, which is one of the functions of serotonin. In the gut is what they call, it contributes to gut motility or peristalsis, which is why if someone takes like an SSRI, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, to increase the availability of serotonin, one of the side effects is diarrhea. It's also one of the reasons why like taking like a real strong serotonin agonist like psilocybin can give someone gut cramps and extreme cases like diarrhea, because it is that you've got all these serotonin receptors in the gut, that are, but they do something different, crucially, to what they might do in the brain. Mostly they're flushing out nasties. Peristalsis is like the motion a worm makes, and they make your gut do that to kind of force stuff through quicker. So what you eat, I'd say like one of the key areas for me. I spoke to a couple of people. I spoke to a microbiologist called Simon Carding at the in Norwich, and he deals with like I'll be honest, the real reason I spoke to him like a little bit is because they do these fecal microbiota transplants, right? These FMTs, and they've been using it to deal with people who've got C. difficile infections, right? Really serious, life-threatening infections in their microbiome. And what they do is they take a cocktail. They get a fecal transplant from someone else. Someone donates their poo that who's got a healthy microbiome. They kind of whisk it up, and then they sort of syringe it into the patient's either up their rear end, or that you can swallow it in something that they call a crapsule, and it will like restore your microbiome. Yeah, I know, right? And there's all these beautiful stories that are like, my dad's poo saved my life and stuff that you see in the papers. So that's like well evidence for C. difficile. But they started to find these other things where there was sort of like brave mice, where they took the microbiome from the quote unquote brave mice, this one strain that are known to be more likely to explore a maze, and they'll jump down from a raised platform quicker. And they injected the microbiome from their gut into from a little pouch that mice have called the cecum, and they took that and they injected it into the timid mice. These ones that are a strain called Balb C that come from like they're traced all the way back to like a 1913 pet shop dealer in like Ohio, and they've just been bred and they're known to be very sort of
wimpy mice,
mouse equivalent of nervous, right? And so they'll inject that microbiome into those mice, and those mice become braver. They become quicker to jump down from a raised platform. So people are like, what the hell's going on here? If you can give one microbiome to another type of mouse that is like genetically, that is like known to be have a hereditary cowardice, and it changes, they don't become as brave as the other mice, but they become more brave, right? What's going on here? So they've been looking at it in humans. Can we change people's gut microbiome and make them braver? so the sort of disappointing answer is like, at the moment, probably not. Like we've looked at it for ages, and it seems to work with mice, but mice have got like 3 inches of gut. We've got like 3 meters. Like there's a reason. Like it was funny speaking to Simon Carding, because he was like almost like pinching his nose, like the number of times he'd had to tell journalists mice and humans are different, and it's like almost surreal to like have that conversation over and over and go, a mouse is not a little person. Like they've got all sorts of differences in their guts. They can't, like mice and rats can't be sick. They don't have a gag reflex, so they've got massive differences in what they can and can't do. But in terms of like your diet, there's plenty of like epidemiological studies, so big studies where they take huge numbers of people, that suggest like there's a mild association with like a Mediterranean diet and lowered risk of anxiety and depression. It's not like a huge one. It's like for 1 in every 45 people who switch to a Mediterranean diet will avoid depression or anxiety that would have otherwise got. But there's like a smallness. But you do that over a population, right? And suddenly you're getting hundreds of thousands of fewer people hitting the mental health system with anxiety and depression, and hundreds of thousands, and that's only clinical level as well, but hundreds of thousands of people potentially who aren't having their life like ruined by this. So it gets to big numbers if you look across a population. But I did speak to you. You asked about inflammation. I spoke to she called herself an immunopsychiatrist. I say she called herself. That was her job title. She's at the University of Southampton, Dr. Rihua Hu, and she told me she looks exclusively at the links between inflammation and depression and also anxiety. And she said that there are, we're finding a bi-directional link between anxiety and chronic inflammation in the body. Now it just so happens that being sort of like chronically overweight increases inflammation in the body. It just so happens that doing lots of exercise reduces inflammation in the body. So if there is a bidirectional link between those two things, we can kind of put the pieces together. And I'm kind of like speculating slightly, although she felt that this was reasonable, that eating a good diet, and that'd be one, a Mediterranean style diet, full of like plant-based like polysaccharides, lots of fiber, things that are going to like increase that gut motility and stuff, is going to reduce inflammation and reduce your risk I think it's fair to say reduce your risk profile of anxiety rather than immediately cure your anxiety. She also mentioned things that I thought she was taking the mickey, to be honest, when she told me them, because she said, it's like, what's some other things you can do? And she said, like be religious. And I was like, that can't be right. And she was like, being religious is reduced with lowered inflammation, this CRT, this marker of inflammation. People who are religious and part of religious communities have lower levels of that. I was like, so I ended up looking into the research of that, and it is true. It doesn't specify what religion. So if you want to kind of you want to start your own cult, apparently that will reduce your chances of anxiety as well. But I suppose the takeaway from all of this is anxiety is not just one thing. It's a bit more like a headache, right? It's a symptom that could have many causes, and it may be that there is a subgroup for whom their chronic anxiety is arising from chronic inflammation, from a kind of feedback loop, from poor diet, lack of moving around, and sort of lowered hormone profiles across a range of things. There's other things that exercise boosts, like this neuropeptide Y is this one particular peptide that's associated with lower anxiety in people who have it, lower rates of PTSD in people who have like high levels of neuropeptide Y. That is produced by doing lots of exercise. So there is a good chance that there is a subgroup of anxiety sufferers who may be, when we've looked at the depression profiles with inflammation, we can see that there are some people who respond really well to just taking anti-inflammatories for their depression. There is like a subgroup who seems to like they
so
seem to.
That's the crux of their depression. That's one of the reasons that their depression manifests.
Yeah, but I would never want to get into this. You can get sucked into these sort of arguments where people are going, so are you saying that like anxiety exists in the brain, or are you saying it's just about inflammation, or are you, surely if someone's like having a stressful life, that's going to contribute. And then there'll be other people who say it's only their environment, and you can't ever say anything about neuroscience, even though like clearly all the thoughts we're having, all the experiences we're having are, in some way instantiated in the brain. Like there is a brain is one of the pieces in this puzzle, right? And sometimes when I get sucked into those, I feel a bit like I'm watching two people have a brutal fist fight over whether Kermit is a Muppet or a frog. It's just like these things can all be contributors. And for me, like inflammation is definitely sort of a reasonable culprit, but it may not be everybody's sort of primary boogeyman kind of behind what's giving them anxiety.
What about childhood trauma and bullying and stuff like that? How does that contribute?
Well, I spoke to a brilliant neuroscientist called Nim Tottenham, who has done lots of studying of like childhood adversity and particularly how it affects brain development, and how when people have had very traumatic childhoods, either because of like a single traumatic incident or because of like lots of different things that have happened, it affects. There's suggestions that it affects brain development in a way that's not always immediately apparent at the age of the trauma, but happens later. Abnormal development of, I've mentioned the amygdala before, but also the hippocampus, which is associated and implicated in parts of memory. we're trying to get away from this idea that one part of the brain is kind of like one department for doing one thing. But certainly hippocampus is important in forming memories, and specifically for anxiety, it seems to be to do with associating certain environments with safety or threat, which is why there seems to be a lot of dysregulation in the hippocampus in soldiers with PTSD, people coming home who can't
hypersensitive to it somehow.
Yeah, you know, that kind of like the kind of classic thing is like a car backfiring, and they think they're kind of under gunfire. But like that the brain's inability to differentiate between a theatre of war and a safe zone. You know, the hippocampus is almost certainly implicated in some level in that. But Nim Tottenham looked at how the brain often she did this great paper that showed that like often our studies suggest that the brain starts to change in adolescence, but as the result of things that happen much, much, much younger. And we might get a sort of upregulation of if you're looking at, I guess, what they call like neuroanatomy, you might get much bigger or much smaller area. It's like the one thing I'd say at the moment is the literature is really ambiguous over whether an area like the amygdala, whether having a big amygdala is worse because you're going to be more anxious, or whether having a smaller one is worse because you have less regulation over anxiety. It's not entirely clear what the relationship is between sort of size and function.
Did they say what sort of age this could begin from? Are we talking about before stuff that we could potentially even remember, sort of toddler age, that there could have been things that have impacted on our brains from then?
Absolutely. I mean, some of the I was looking at one study that was suggesting that we can't start forming coherent autobiographical memories that we're able to retell to people until about 2.5. So, you know, they could be things that you don't remember, but certainly, like from the moment you're born, you are learning, your threat circuits are active, right? Like babies are not great at certain types of threat perception, but you come out of the womb with sort of like flinch responses to, say, like being dropped or pain or things like that. Babies, for a while, they've done these great studies where they get babies to crawl out over a perspex floor that suddenly underneath is a cliff, like drops away. And, you know, at a crawling age, they will just crawl happily out over the edge. On this perspex thing, they don't know that they're on a see-through kind of like ledge. And then there'll be a certain developmental point where they'll go, I'm afraid of heights now. So we know that some fears are acquired, some are developmental steps. Like it's good when a child starts to get a little bit of stranger fear. There'll be a moment where a child gets a bit more clingy. Well, they're starting to differentiate between faces. That's quite good. You know, obviously, like it can be pathological, but it's a neuro anatomical and neuro developmental milestone that's actually pretty great, right? Like they're learning to go, this face is safe, this is a stranger. But yeah, from really early on, Nim Tottenham did a great study in mice where they played them music when they were born, like they play a particular song. And then they found mice don't normally like to nest around any noise at all, like they're naturally timid. But then if this song was played when they were adult mice, they would want to go, they'd prefer to go and make their nest when this music was playing. So they tried it with adults. They got people in and they played them songs. They did this very stressful test where it's this like notorious test called the trias, where basically you're made to do a maths test that is rigged, that you're always going to fail. It's going to be too hard. And the answers come too quickly. There's like a loud horn sounds every time you get one wrong. You can see a bar that's supposedly how other people who've done the test before did, and you're always doing much worse than that bar, right? People report doing this trias as like the most stressful thing. It's more stressful than like noxious thermal stimuli where their hand is burnt, more stressful than seeing like graphic photos of like corpses. The trias is what people find the most stressful and don't want to go back and do again. And she did this test where they would be made stressed by that, and then they'd either be played some random music, or one group were played music from this, what they call the critical period, which is like around 5 and 6. And if she found that when people were played the music from 5 and 6, it reliably reduced their stress levels more than the control music.
You mean that they went back to the time when these people would have been 5 and 6, looked at the typical songs that were playing on the radio, so it was Phil music, Collins exactly. Or whatever the fuck.
Yeah. So everyone will have like a critical period. So her theory is that this is a critical developmental period when we are learning safety, because people who had a trauma around that age, their critical developmental period was shifted earlier to about 3 or 4. So as if the brain just goes, shit, we're not going to have time to fully develop. We need to like get things going, right? So they tended to respond better to music that was. What was the response? A couple of years
the threat response was downregulated. What happened?
Yeah, so it's lowering of cortisol levels. So they'll do like cortisol swabs. It's also things like they'll do galvanic skin resistance. So they'll check the sweatiness of skin and things like heart rate as well. They'll also just get people to, because I got quite like obsessed with all these kind of like objective measures of like anxiety, but they'll also just ask people, what is your subjective experience? How stressed are you feeling right now? Which is always like a useful thing to do, because sometimes you can get a lot of studies they've done on neuroscience and stuff. They'll get parts of the brain that are supposedly associated with threat flashing up, and they'll go, oh, this person must be scared. But then when you ask someone in the scanner, are you feeling scared? They'll go, no. And actually, some of those studies, I spoke to one neuroscientist, Alexander Shackman, who was like, actually, one of the problems we have is the tests are kind of boring and people fall asleep in the scanner. So clearly we can't be studying anxiety if like someone's like fallen asleep because they're so bored, and you're going, these people are scared of these things. So yeah, like the response was people were they were like moving into that kind of parasympathetic rest and digest state of kind of going, it's like almost like those songs are safety cues for them.
Okay, and so is the lesson, what's the lesson to take from that when it comes to childhood trauma and adult anxiety?
Well, like there's two, and like one of them is like the obvious ones that like we've got to like really protect children and make sure they grow up in the best environments possible, because these things can have disproportionate effects on how they grow up. But I would also say, as an adult, you can, if you've been through difficult things in your childhood, it can be the most depressing thing in the world for someone to go, oh yeah, I'm afraid you're screwed, and here's like 50 studies proving it. We're seeing more and more like neuroplasticity is still a thing. So what I would say is there is clearly an effect from that critical period of music, and you might find that listening to songs from that period help you. But I'm not convinced that having like looked across the literature, that effect is necessarily bigger than just listening to music that you love, right? I'm not sure. It might be an effect, but whenever we find an effect in research, we've got to ask compared to what. And I'd say probably those songs do work better than random songs. Do they work better than like your favorite songs? I don't know. But in terms of like what we can do about it, the takeaway is that, yeah, you may have had experiences early on that have predisposed your brain to go, not in a nasty way, it's not even pathological, it's gone, okay, the world is a dangerous place. We are going to be on the lookout for stuff, and we're going to look around and make sure that we spot this early. So someone might have social anxiety, right? They might like constantly think, does this person hate me? You might be on a train and there's a couple of people are drinking, and you start getting anxious, and part of your brain is thinking, is it going to kick off? Are these people going to be a couple of drinks down the line and going to start like getting leery? And am I going to get in a fight? Well, all of that is actually quite compassionate and rational of your brain if you grew up in an environment where, like, don't piss off dad. If dad comes home and he's had a few, like, just get out of the way, like, spot the early warning signs that someone might be not safe to be around, like, and try and spot the moments where the shift in the tone of voice. If you've grown up around that, there's like a little note of warning in someone's voice, and that is the time you're going to get a hiding if you don't get out of the way. your brain's going to go, cool. Like, well, that's cool. We're going to apply that.
That's an adaptive lesson. Yeah, that's a useful
it is
thing.
Yeah, like if you have a soldier like in a theater of war who's just prepared to like walk through an urban environment where there are like installed snipers sort of whistling and like twiddling an umbrella around their finger, you wouldn't go, oh, that's great, that's like a healthy human being who has no anxiety disorder. These things are contextual, they're deeply contextual, right? That you would think that person has rightly, I think you would think that person has lost their mind. Their behavior would be maladaptive. To be non-anxious and to not have any threat perception in a dangerous environment is in some cases fatal, as we've sort of said before, when people, you know, are unable to tell if someone's trustworthy or not. The question is, and I think the question that anyone's got to ask is like, how's that working out for you? Basically, is this still serving me? If it's not, there is no indication that the brain is not plastic. The brain is changing all the time, which is why I got a lot of neuroscientists laughing at me when I was going, I read a study that said 8 weeks of meditation can change the shape of the brain. And they're like, yeah, like taking a shit changes the shape of the brain. Like if you do that in the same loo every day, every action we do changes the brain. Every action we do is making new connections, strengthening connections, wrapping these myelin sheaths around neurons. This is, you know, what they call Hebb's postulate. What fires together, wires together. You cannot do a thing in your life that isn't changing your brain. So I would, you know, I think it's a really important takeaway is to say, like, you know, of course, there are neurological conditions. You can take a brain injury that affects your brain, but in terms of a childhood experience, meaning that you are destined for all your life to you can't get better, you can't improve. I'd say there is the research simply doesn't support that at all. Is the good news. Like the research doesn't support the idea that you can't change the brain. I'd say it's almost impossible not to be changing the brain with almost every action and decision you make, which is its own kind of existential crisis. You're like, what habits am I laying down?
You don't get to not make a habit, man. You only get to choose which type of habit you want to make. That's what people need to remember. Like every action that you take moves you toward a tomorrow that is more likely for you to do that thing again. You know, you want to eat the cookie or not eat the cookie. It's not just a case of eating the cookie is not eating the cookie. It's also ingraining the eat the cookie module. So one of the things, talking about identity, our sense of self, growing up and being an adult and stuff like that, something that I'm really, really interested in, given the fact that you're a man, you're a professional, you have an identity, you have people that follow you online, you've got this big course that loads of people have done about coaching them to write and stuff, father, husband, masculine purpose in the modern world, all this sort of thing. Something that I'm really interested in is how you have dealt with the sense of self-referential feelings around being someone that has panic attacks. You know, did you struggle with masculinity, with your identity, with what you feel your place in the world is, given the fact that you're doing something that traditionally is not seen as that protector, provider stereotype?
I mean, so yeah, absolutely. And I think that, of course, like you want to, part of you's like imagines that you're above all that, and you kind of go, well, I don't really, you know, I'm confident enough in my own masculinity to not feel threatened by that. But when you are on the floor, like having shoved like a towel in your mouth to try and cover the sound of you screaming so your baby daughter doesn't hear because you don't want her to be afraid in sort of 2 rooms away while your wife looks after her, and because you're scared of nothing. Also you're just in your house, right? There's no threat. I think it's impossible for anyone, no matter what their relationship to masculinity, to feel diminished by that. We know actually from some really interesting studies I read that people who have more of a sense of sort of what we might think of as sort of traditional masculine values. And I want to be careful how I say that, because that's a bit loaded. But the idea that men shouldn't get anxious, that men should be sort of self-sufficient, to consistently have worse, are more likely to get PTSD and have worse symptoms when they do.
Why do you think that is?
I think if you can't, well, we know that the ability to, it's going to sound so like obscenely simple, but the ability to talk to someone about what you're feeling and have it validated and be heard is, like, I think, fundamental to getting over anything. To be able to go, like, partly because it means you've got to be able to articulate it yourself, so it requires some level of self-insight. And if it shatters your identity to go, at the moment I'm really anxious, I'm not coping, so you can't let that in, you're going to constantly have an incongruence between your daily experience and the person you want to be, and you'll know that you're not living up to what you want to be, right? Like, you can say it all the time, but you know, and so you constantly feel like a failure, right? You continually do. Also, if you can't go to a doctor or, you know, or just a friend, right, and say, I'm having the shittest time, I'm getting, like, stressed, I like getting keyed up, I can't sleep at the moment, I'm like, keep thinking there's someone in the back garden going to break in, I was up at 2:00, like, with a flashlight, like, all of these things. If you can't speak to someone and they go, yeah, like what I was talking about earlier that sounded like a throwaway line about religiosity reducing inflammation, well, one of the reasons that might be is just people having supportive communities who they can go to, where it's normalized to go, I'm having a shit time, I've just been bereaved, you know, like in a religious community, if you lose someone in your life, they die, it's expected that you'll be able to talk to them about it. And that is in itself, like, has such it may even account for many of the instances of the placebo effect that sort of so bedevil psychological research, in that just going to someone, in fact, when we look across all types of evidence-based therapy, it doesn't matter what the modality is, right? It doesn't matter what type of therapy it is, they all perform about the same. And a lot of that, I think, is just being in a room with someone who listens. We're a social, gregarious species. We are which is why I think, like, so many people found, like, lockdown, and I don't think you could have done anything worse for people's mental health than stop people being able to meet up with each other. It's like such a terrifying thing, especially, and then people dying outside, right? Those two things in combination, terrible for people's mental health. And I think there's loads of great aspects to masculine values. You know, there's one of the things I talked about with Dave Thomas about exercise and stuff. Setting and meeting challenges is one of the things that, you know, helps my anxiety the most. Like, pushing myself, not going, I need to sort of back away from this. The more you back away from challenges, I think it's understandable that we want to, people and everyone around you will say, you should rest, you should, you know, give yourself a break. But actually, the stuff that's always helped me has been like, I'm going to train to run a marathon.
Yeah,
you know, like,
lean into it, man. This is one of the things, the kind of recursive self loop that I see, and I've seen it myself. So throughout my 20s, I was struggling with low mood, depression. I don't know whether it would have been clinical. I went to a GP when I was 21, and they gave me a single printout and sort of ushered me on my way. So I'm hoping that that the NHS has improved a little bit since then. But throughout all of that time, when I was suffering with low mood and stuff like that, so much of what happens is you become increasingly less able to lean into discomfort. A difficult thing happens, or there's a challenge that's placed in front of you, and you get to the stage where getting out of bed seems like an insurmountable task. You think, look, I simply can't go and have a shower. I simply can't go and make myself some food, or even be bothered to go and get myself a glass of water. And then you do it and you come back and you go, oh my God, like that's me for today. That's me done for the day. And then what you see when you're in a good place is that reverses. You see that you're more able, you're more anti-fragile. You go into the gym and you're putting more weight on, and there's this sort of, it is a masculine value, right? You sort of grit your teeth and get through this very, very difficult thing that you're doing. And it's not out of some sense of fear. It's out of a sense that you know that you can and that you're going to do more and you're motivated. But both of these spiral either down or up the same way, you know?
Well, What's so fascinating about that is that I actually ended up having that confirmed. The bit where that part clicked for me was when I was speaking to AI scientists, right? There's this whole field of psychology now called computational psychology, where we started making like self-piloting drones that would become neurotic, that would stop leaving the factory, right? And we started having AIs that were acting a bit like people with anxiety disorders, right? The self-driving cars. Really interesting speaking to a friend who like works, you know, as a researcher for self-driving cars, and they had all these problems with the self-driving cars in Milton Keynes, where they were so these cars are made to not crash into people, right? And the public realized that the cars were really conservative in how they drive, so they just start walking out in front of them, and it got so self-driving cars would like be stopping and starting and just creeping along because because people adapt their behavior around them. Well, what we see with AIs is we started to notice that some AIs would sort of would travel less and less far in like route finding, and then eventually just wouldn't go anywhere. And what it was is they were learning about threats, taking evasive action, and then maybe that threat was only temporary. Maybe a seagull was flying through that area at that one time. But because they never try that route again, they stop updating their data on that. Because when we do anything, and this comes from like from computational psychology and this kind of AI science, we're actually surreptitiously doing two things, right? We're doing the action, we're doing the behavior. We're also collecting data on the results of that behavior. Well, when you're depressed, if you stop leaving the house, you stop receiving data on what it's like to leave the house, right? And your whole schematic of what threats are in the world and what the world is even like gets more and more skewed. It gets more, you get, your data becomes more outdated, and you get a data set from a tinier and tinier cluster of behaviors. Well, as soon as you start doing the opposite, I wouldn't even say to people, you have to get to the stage where you believe, I can smash this, I can get fit, I can go down the gym, and I can bench past my personal best. All you have to do is be a good scientist and go, should we test this? Like, should we do a test? Because like, depression sitting on your shoulder, it's like, or anxiety or whatever, it's going like, okay, that is a good hypothesis. I can't do this. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens, right? We can do this. Let's do 4 trials. Let's do this properly, right? Because if you're so convinced, you're not going to be scared for me trying this, right? Because you're going to be proven rapturously right. So let's try it out. And then, of course, what happens is you go, shit. Oh, I did that. So if I was wrong about that one localized misbelief, what other things could I be wrong about? And then the whole
but that's the spiral again. That's that recursive spiral that I'm talking about. The problem and the point at which I've been at staring at the ceiling of a bedroom for more days than I care to remember, trying to break the inertia between those two worlds, trying to break the inertia of I can't do this to let's try and do this. And that is the point at which I got stuck an awful lot, and I think a lot of other people do. And now, many years hence and a lot of self-work and stuff like that, it's increasingly difficult for me to think about that. And it's increasingly easy for me to find equanimity when something bad happens, and increasingly easy for me to lean into discomfort when I need to as well. And, it might relapse at some point in the future or whatever, but every single time that even anything difficult does happen, it seems to happen less. And that spiral makes me feel empathetic for the previous version of me that I used to be, because I know how far that person was from having that positive reinforcement, from overcoming something and knowing that we'll be okay and getting out the other side and it's fine, it's just for now, it's not forever, and all of that stuff. That learning process is very meaningful.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, that feedback as well. It goes back to kind of like the old kind of like classical conditioning that Pavlov was doing with the dogs, where his lab where he was testing these dogs, where he was sounding a buzzer or having the ticking of a metronome and showing them like a bowl of meat powder, and they would salivate, and he would measure that they would learn to associate the buzzer or the ticking of the metronome with food, and they'd salivate just at the noise, right? Well, he had a flood in his lab, one night, and all the dogs had to be rescued, and it was very traumatic for them. Like the water was coming up to because it was in a basement area, right? And the dogs had like a pretty shit life under Pavlov anyway, but like this was particularly bad. But afterwards, they found that all the dogs they had in the lab were no longer. They couldn't do that classical conditioning after that. Something had frozen in them, and they couldn't learn new associations. And this has been like in the work of in the work on learned helplessness, where a dog gets sort of like one area of the floor will be electrocuted and another won't, and it will be shown a light and it has to move from one to the other, and eventually they make the task impossible for the dog. Eventually it will just lie down and let itself be electrocuted. And the only way that you can retrain a dog that has been through that is the experimenter has to like literally go in and drag the dog onto the safe area of floor to show that its assumptions about what is and isn't safe, once they make the test possible to win again, the dog won't bother to learn that it can win it, because it's just learned that life is impossible.
But the dog's inertia around its own worldview is so high that it on its own can't overcome it.
And so an experimenter has to like come in and literally it's hot. Don't do that to dogs. Like I could have told you that a dog would be depressed if you electrocute it repeatedly, but nonetheless the lesson from this is you drag the dog onto the safe area, and you do that repeatedly, and eventually it's like, okay, my assumptions about the world are wrong. But it is not going to do that itself, and that's what we can end up like basically in this kind of metaphor is like we just stay on that electrocuted part of the floor. And I saw this in other experiments. This guy Peter Loverbond did one where people would get an electric shock just before a sort of blue square would be flashed up on the screen, and they'd be told there's a button, right, and you can press it, and if you press it like within a second of the blue square coming up, the electric shock won't happen. And what they found is that the button could be wired to nothing, right, and they just tell people that's what's going on. And they learn to press the button, and they think they're stopping an electric shock, but there was actually never going to be one. And then when they're shown a blue square, people who had that button to press will get a jolt of anxiety, all those kind of like physiological signs of it, even though they've never been electrocuted by that blue square. And people who weren't given a button to press, who didn't think that there was any safety behavior, who actually then had the moment of going, I'm going to be electrocuted. Oh no, there was no electric shock. Unlearn that association and don't find it scary anymore. And this is something they call safety behaviors, like our ability to people thinking, I'll have a panic attack on the bus unless I have to sit like one of two seats by the driver. And this is the second bit I wanted to get on really quick based on what you were saying about like facing up to stuff. Is I spoke to this amazing researcher from Oxford University called Dr. Andrea Reinecker, who I heard about her. Someone told me about her and I thought that can't be true, where she was curing people of their phobias and anxieties, like claustrophobics, by locking them in a dark cupboard, while giving them this thing called dicycloserine, which is like increases neuroplasticity, and saying you won't be let out. Like, I'm going to put you in there and I'm not telling you when I come back. Can't call for me. Don't scream. Don't do anything. And these are people with like chronic, like really bad claustrophobia. And you just have to trust I'll come back. And you can't do any safe behaviors. No taking, a rescue remedy or a propranolol. You can't like do rosary beads. You can't pray. You can't tell yourself the nice lady will be back soon. You just got to sit there and just like bathe in it.
How the fuck is this ethical?
Well, it had people's, it had their informed consent. There was a pretty reasonable dropout rate. A lot of people don't want to go through it, right? It's rough. One of the tricks was actually she came back in 15 minutes. People had like cleared the whole day. They thought they might be shutting there all day. She came back in 50 minutes. Her like cure rate is one of the highest I've seen out of any treatment. We know that like phobias are probably one of the most amenable to treatment out of anything we can do. But these people would like have their amygdala response and their phobic response like normalized. I think it was something like at least 2/3, that was it. Like 15 minutes and their phobia was cured. Their claustrophobia was cured, which is nuts.
Why?
Right?
What's happening there? Is it the drug?
So dicyclocerin is a controversial drug to use in this situation. I read one paper that was called, right, so you will have already guessed what the problem with giving something that increases neuroplasticity is if you put them in a very traumatic situation. And the paper was called Dicyclocerin Making Good Exposures Better and Better Exposures Worse, right? If the person panics in there and starts doing safety behaviors, the neuroplasticity bakes that trauma in harder, which is why they're looking at some other possibilities because it's a risky thing to use. It's no good sitting down to someone and saying the spider isn't going to bite you. Like how many times have you been bitten by a spider? None. How many people do you know have been killed by spiders in your friendship circle in the UK? None, right? It's no good telling someone that it's not getting to the parts of the brain that are making them feel like they're going to die and they've got to get out of there. Your brain does not believe in hearsay. It doesn't care about that. It's got to experience it. And what going in that cupboard gives is like a cast iron experience. You have just gone up against everything you feared, and it had jack shit. Like, you turned round to the axe murderer who's chasing you in the dream, and you stood, and it turned out they were just a phantom, right? And there is something, I mean, of course, like on a like conscious level, the idea of like facing your fear, we can all kind of like understand how invigorating that must feel. But just on the kind of neurological level, and again, I'm talking about, I spoke to several neuroscientists who are like, their names are in, I got a copy of the manual Neuroscience out of the library, and I looked up like the last living name in the history section on anxiety, and then I phoned him, I emailed him, and he was like, yeah, I'll speak to you. And I got to speak to this guy Joe Ledoux, who's like the amazing neuroscientist who deals with anxiety and like undoubtedly the most famous in the world. And he said that what you've got to do is let these parts of the brain, he talked about the amygdala and the hippocampus, just like learn that the threat is not a threat. But you can't do that consciously. It's got to happen non-consciously. It's got to go through it and go, yeah, oh, okay, stand down, everyone. Like, turns out we were worrying about nothing. You can't talk to that part of the brain, theoretically.
So, having gone through all of these different strategies, tons of different techniques for trying to reduce anxiety, what is it that you've come to believe on the other side of it, as someone who had a lot of first-hand experience, but also has now done a good bit of research with 1,000 papers that you've read? What have you come to believe about what does and doesn't help anxiety? How's this changed the way that you deal with it in your daily life?
Well, anxiety makes us crave certainty, right? I think anyone who's dealing with anxiety wants, like, I don't mind saying I wanted easy answers, right? I just wanted someone to say, this is what you need to do. Anxiety craves certainty. It submits to authority. We want people just to tell us what to do. And the way out, and it sucks, is uncertainty. It's exactly what you were talking about when you were saying that moment of doubt where you go, what if my beliefs about the world are wrong? There is something much more terrifying behind anxiety. And I think the key to it is in people who have been through childhood traumas and yet blame themselves somehow. And I spoke to one guy who did like psychedelic therapies and worked with people who've been through really, really grim shit, doing psychedelics and doing therapy while they were under the influence. And I said, why would someone think that was their fault? And the key thing is, if it's not your fault, then it wasn't under your control. If it wasn't under your control, there actually is no sequence of things you can totally do to stop bad things happening again. That is the horrible truth about being a human alive in the world that we are asking anxious people to embrace when we ask them to come out of the woods, right? And I think that's where we've got to start, right? That it's there's a reason to hold on to the destructive beliefs of anxiety and panic, and it is that if I can just hate myself enough, I can like and set the algorithm up, the fear algorithm. I can actually predict any threat, and I can actually make my life safe. You can't. You just can't. We can do sensible things. I'm not saying you should like drink a quart of whiskey and go dance on the motorway, but you cannot structure your life to avoid pain, threat. Like, it's just not possible, and that is a bitter pill to swallow in the midst of anxiety. But it's also where liberation lies, and that is the. I mean, if you told me that at the beginning, I would have been so angry. I've been like, you don't understand. And I'd say, no, I don't understand. So let's talk about it. Because the other thing is all of this stuff about, oh, this is how, the cardiopulmonary system works. This is the hormone cascade, is all for naught unless someone feels understood. This is what the anxiety therapist of 25 years, this guy, he's also an author, Mike Shell, told me. He said, he used to go in, he said, like talking to people about the fight-flight response and telling them all the literature and just dumping it on them. And he said he realized that you can't get anywhere until you feel like you've been understood, until someone has heard you. And you go, because that was the breakthrough moment for me. And you go, that's right. Oh, you get it. That's exactly how it is. And then and it's almost like when you accept that, and when you've been heard, all this other stuff is like, actually, all this other shit is very relatively easy, because we know, like, oh, people go, I know I should do exercise. I know I should eat better. I know I should challenge myself, but I can't. And that thing about the impossible task you were talking about, you can't like people are going, we need to, like, the world is very stressful and we need to campaign for sort of a more just world. Well, I agree with that, but at the moment, I can't like bring myself to like have a wash. So can you understand why I'm not in a state to like upend the current system? Like, that's not helpful to me. Well, like, one of the things that unlocks that ability to start doing things that are in your best interest is in the moment where the message of anxiety feels like it's delivered, like the little carrier pigeon of your anxiety has like delivered that message to someone, and they've heard you and they've gone, that is shit. And you've explained it to them, and you hear yourself say it as well, and you hear them say it back to you, and you go, fuck, that's actually, now I say all that out loud, that's pretty bad, isn't it? I've been through a lot. I'm quite courageous. Then like a whole bunch of stuff melts, and then a whole bunch of energy that you've been using to be anxious, you can start like redirecting that like adrenaline's fucking great. You can use that to, like, I started doing like boxing 1-to-1 lessons, and it like beat the shit out of me. I went to the guy, I was like, I just want to learn how to get punched in the face. And he was like, yeah, let's do this. And it was great. And I'm like, it is scary. It's not great. I don't enjoy particularly having like someone swing at me and punch me in the head, right? But it's funny. it is funny in a boxing context to do all that stuff. And I'm like, oh, I've got all this adrenaline and energy. I can use this to like just rant it on like a step machine or a bike, or doing sprints, or like getting the kind of like battle ropes, and it's knackering you, and you're like, this, oh, like adrenaline feels good. So ultimately, I think like none of it I think can start until you have felt understood. And if you can't find someone else to do that, then being able to write it down, and at least for you to come to terms with it, I think everything else comes out of that, and that's why some of this stuff about all the other stuff that we know we should do but we can't bring ourselves to do, that falls into place when that kind of like the core part of you inside, which is just like this kid that is freaking out, feels like someone's got the message, and then they're like, okay, stand down, alarms off. Now, what were you saying about like eating some vegetables? I can do that now because I've like delivered my message.
Tim Clare, ladies and gentlemen, if people want to check out what you do online, where should they go?
You can follow me on Twitter at Tim Clare Poet, or you can just go to my website, timclarepoet.co.uk.
And Coward as well. Your book will be linked in the show notes below. Tim, I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
What's happening, people? Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that episode, then press here for a selection of the best clips from the podcast over the last few weeks. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.